The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty auction block in Montezuma, Colorado, where Katerina Sawyer stood with her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her worn boots, knowing that her silence had finally condemned her to this fate in the summer of 1878. She was 20 years old, and the voices around her blurred into a cacophony of cruel assessments and dismissive remarks. The auctioneer, a rotund man with tobacco-stained teeth, gestured broadly as he addressed the gathered crowd of miners, ranchers, and drifters who had come to this mining town, nestled in the San Juan Mountains. Her uncle stood off to the side, counting coins in his weathered palm, his face betraying no emotion as he prepared to sell off the niece who had become nothing more than a burden after her aunt's death 6 months prior. Katerina had not spoken a single word since the fever took her voice when she was 7 years old. The illness had ravaged her small body for weeks, and when she finally recovered, her vocal cords remained damaged beyond repair. She could make small sounds, gasps and sighs, but words would never pass her lips again. Her aunt had been patient, had learned to read the expressions in Katerina's expressive hazel eyes, had understood the meaning behind her gestures. But her uncle had always seen her as defective, useless, another mouth to feed with no value in return. "She is strong enough for housework," the auctioneer called out. "Young, healthy, obedient, cannot talk back, which some of you men might consider an advantage." The crowd laughed, and Katerina felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She kept her gaze downward, her long auburn hair falling forward to shield her face. She wore a faded blue dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. $50, someone called from the back. 60. Another voice joined. Katerina closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. This was her reality now. She would be sold like livestock to whoever bid highest, would spend the rest of her life as property, as something less than human. Her chest tightened with a familiar frustration, the constant companion of someone who had thoughts and feelings and opinions but no voice to express them. 75, a deeper voice said, and something in the tone made Katerina glance up. The man who had spoken stood apart from the main crowd, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dirt street. He wore a dusty black hat pulled low over his eyes, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and dark trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots. A gun belt sat comfortably on his hips, and his tanned face bore the weathered look of someone who spent most of his days outdoors. She could not see his eyes clearly from this distance, but she felt the weight of his gaze on her. 75 going once, the auctioneer announced with barely concealed glee. This was more money than he had expected for the mute girl. The crowd had fallen silent, waiting to see if anyone would challenge the bid. Katerina studied the tall man, trying to understand what he saw when he looked at her, what purpose he had in mind. She had heard stories about the things men did to women they purchased, and her stomach churned with dread. 75 going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. No one else spoke. The miners and ranchers had lost interest or lacked the funds to continue. The tall man remained motionless, a statue carved from Western stone. Sold to the gentleman in the black hat. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Katerina's bones. Her uncle stepped forward immediately to collect his payment, and the tall man moved through the crowd with an easy, unhurried stride. Up close, she could see that he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and striking blue-gray eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Name is Clayton Prescott," he said, not to her but to the auctioneer. I will take the bill of sale. Right here, Mr. Prescott. The auctioneer scribbled on a piece of paper, blotted it, and handed it over. Pleasure doing business. Clayton folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket without looking at it. Then his eyes settled on Katerina, and for a long moment he simply observed her. She met his gaze directly, refusing to cower, even as fear coiled in her belly. If she was to be property, she would at least maintain her dignity. "Can you walk on your own?" he asked. She nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement. "Then come on. I have a long ride back to my ranch." He turned and walked away, clearly expecting her to follow. Katerina glanced back once at her uncle, but the man had already disappeared into the nearest saloon, his pockets heavier than they had been an hour ago. She had no possessions to collect, nothing but the dress on her back and the worn boots on her feet. Taking a deep breath, she followed Clayton Prescott through the crowded street of Montezuma. His horse waited at the hitching post outside the general store, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Clayton untied the reins and swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, then extended his hand down toward her. "Put your foot in the stirrup and take my hand. I will pull you up." Katerina hesitated. She had never ridden a horse before, had spent her entire life in town helping her aunt with laundry and mending. But she had no choice, so she placed her foot as instructed and grasped his hand. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip strong as he pulled her up behind the saddle as though she weighed nothing. "Hold onto my waist," he instructed. "It is about 2 hours to my property, and the trail can get rough." She wrapped her arms tentatively around his midsection, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him, the way his body moved with the horse as they started down the main street. She had never been this close to a man before, had never touched anyone with this kind of familiarity. It felt strange and uncomfortable, and somehow not entirely unpleasant. They rode in silence through Montezuma and out into the vast wilderness beyond. The mountains rose majestically around them, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat. Pine forests stretched across the slopes, and the air grew cooler and cleaner as they climbed higher along a narrow trail. Katerina watched the landscape pass by, trying not to think about what awaited her at the end of this journey. After nearly an hour, Clayton spoke without turning his head. "I imagine you have questions, even if you cannot ask them." Katerina stared at the back of his hat, unsure how to respond. "I purchased you because I need help at my ranch. My mother passed last winter, and I have been managing alone since then. The house has fallen into disrepair, the cooking is terrible, and I am drowning in mending. I need someone who can handle domestic work." He paused, and Katerina felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Domestic work she could do. "I will not hurt you," he continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "You will have your own room, and I expect you to keep it clean. You will earn your keep through honest work, and in return, you will have food, shelter, and safety. That is the arrangement." Katerina processed this information carefully. It sounded too good to be true, but his tone held no deception that she could detect. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hope that her situation might not be as dire as she had feared. "I know you cannot speak," Clayton said. "My mother had a sister who lost her hearing after a childhood illness. She taught me that there are many ways to communicate beyond words. We will figure it out." Something warm unfurled in Katerina's chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. She tightened her grip slightly around his waist, a gesture of acknowledgement, and she felt rather than saw him nod. The rest of the ride passed in companionable silence. The trail eventually opened onto a wide valley cradled between mountain slopes, where a creek ran swift and clear through meadows dotted with wildflowers. A modest ranch house sat near the tree line, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and a small corral where several horses grazed peacefully. "Welcome to Prescott Ranch," Clayton said as they approached. He dismounted first, then helped her down with the same easy strength he had shown earlier. Katerina stood on shaky legs, her body stiff from the unaccustomed ride, and looked around at what would now be her home. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, so different from the cramped quarters above the laundry where she had spent most of her life. "Come inside. I will show you around." The interior of the house was dim and cool after the bright sunlight. The main room served as kitchen and living area combined, with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with dishes and supplies. 2 doors led off to what Katerina assumed were bedrooms. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and dirty dishes were piled in a basin near the hand pump. Clayton had not been exaggerating about the state of disrepair. "That door leads to my room," he said, pointing to the left. "That one will be yours. There are clean linens in the trunk at the foot of the bed, and you should find everything you need. Take some time to settle in, and then perhaps you could make something for supper. There is venison in the cold box and vegetables in the root cellar out back." He removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door, running a hand through his dark hair. In the dimmer light of the house, Katerina could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much work. "I will be in the barn tending to the horses if you need anything. Just come find me." He left her standing in the middle of the main room, and Katerina took a moment to simply breathe. This was real. This was happening. She was no longer in Montezuma, no longer standing on an auction block, no longer living under her uncle's resentful roof. Whatever happened next, it had to be better than what she had left behind. She explored her new room first. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a trunk that contained neatly folded quilts and linens that smelled faintly of lavender. A single window looked out over the meadow and the mountains beyond. Katerina sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and went to work. She started with the dishes, pumping fresh water and heating it over the fireplace. The venison she found was fresh and well preserved in the cold box, and the root cellar yielded potatoes, carrots, and onions. She had learned to cook at her aunt's side, had memorized recipes and techniques during the years when her aunt's patient voice had filled their small kitchen. Her hands moved through familiar motions, and she found comfort in the simple, honest work. By the time the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, she had cleaned the kitchen, prepared a hearty stew, and baked bread using flour and yeast she found in the pantry. The house smelled of food and soap, a vast improvement over the stale, dusty odor that had greeted her arrival. Clayton came in as she was setting the table, his shirt damp with sweat and his hands freshly washed. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the transformed kitchen. "You have been busy," he said, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice. Katerina gestured toward the table in invitation, and he needed no further encouragement. He sat down heavily, clearly exhausted, and waited as she ladled stew into bowls and set out the bread with butter she had found wrapped in cloth in the cold box. They ate in silence at first, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Clayton ate with the focused intensity of a man who had been surviving on his own cooking for too long, and Katerina found herself pleased by his evident enjoyment of the meal. She ate more slowly, her mind still processing everything that had happened. "This is excellent," Clayton said, breaking the quiet. "Thank you." She nodded, meeting his eyes across the table. In the soft light of the oil lamp, his face had lost some of its hard edges. He looked younger, more approachable, though still carrying an air of competence and strength that she imagined was necessary for surviving alone in this wilderness. "I should tell you more about the work here," he continued. "I run cattle primarily, about 50 head that I graze in the high meadows during summer. I also have the horses, chickens, and a vegetable garden that is currently being overtaken by weeds. The days start early, usually before dawn, and I am often out on the range until evening. You will be responsible for the house, the cooking, the garden, and the chickens. Can you handle that?" Katerina considered the question seriously, then nodded. It was no more work than she had done for her aunt, and probably less than she would have faced with many other buyers at that auction. "Good." Clayton tore off another piece of bread. "I will pay you wages despite what that paper says. $5 a month to start, more if the ranch does well. You are a worker, not a slave, and you deserve compensation." Katerina's eyes widened in surprise. She had not expected this, had assumed she would be given food and shelter, and nothing more. The fact that he planned to pay her, to treat her as an employee rather than property, shifted something fundamental in how she viewed this situation. "We will establish some basic signals," Clayton continued. "If you need to get my attention, ring the bell outside the door. If something is wrong or if you need help, wave a red cloth from the window. I will check on you regularly, but I want you to have a way to communicate urgency." It was more consideration than anyone had shown her in years. Katerina felt an unfamiliar tightness in her throat, the phantom sensation of words she could not speak building behind her teeth. Instead, she reached across the table and gently touched the back of his hand, just for a moment. A gesture of gratitude. Clayton looked down at where her fingers had briefly rested, then back up at her face. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended language. Then he cleared his throat and stood, picking up his empty bowl. "I will help with the dishes, then turn in early. Tomorrow will be a long day." They worked side by side in the small kitchen, and Katerina found herself acutely aware of his presence, the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the way he seemed comfortable in the domestic space despite his obvious lack of practice. When the last dish was dried and put away, he bid her good night and disappeared into his room. Katerina stood alone in the main room for a long moment, listening to the night sounds filtering through the windows. Crickets chirping, the distant call of an owl, the gentle murmur of the creek. Then she retired to her own room, changed into a nightgown she found in the trunk, and lay down on the narrow bed. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind raced with everything that had happened, with the drastic change in her circumstances, with the strange man who had purchased her freedom only to give her a portion of it back. Clayton Prescott was nothing like what she had expected, and that uncertainty both comforted and frightened her. The days that followed established a rhythm. Katerina woke before dawn to start breakfast, and Clayton would emerge from his room with his hair damp from washing, smelling of soap and leather. They ate together in comfortable silence, and then he would head out to work the ranch while she tackled the endless list of domestic tasks. She discovered that she enjoyed the work, enjoyed having purpose and autonomy in a way she had never experienced in her uncle's house. She tended the chickens and collected eggs, weeded the garden and harvested vegetables, washed clothes in the creek and hung them to dry in the mountain sunshine. The house slowly transformed under her care, becoming cleaner and more organized, more like a home than a bachelor's neglected dwelling. Clayton proved to be a man of his word in every respect. He treated her with courtesy and respect, never raising his voice or his hand, never making demands that were unreasonable. He seemed genuinely interested in making their unconventional arrangement work, and he made efforts to communicate with her in ways that transcended speech. One evening about 2 weeks after her arrival, he brought home a small chalkboard and several pieces of chalk. "I thought this might help," he said, setting it on the table. "If you need to tell me something complicated, you can write it down." Katerina picked up the chalk with trembling fingers. Her aunt had taught her to read and write, skills that were often denied to girls of her station, and she had treasured those lessons. She wrote carefully, "Thank you for your kindness." Clayton read the words and something softened in his expression. "You are welcome. I know this situation is not what either of us would have chosen, but I want you to feel safe here." She wrote again, "I do feel safe." And it was true. Despite everything, despite the strangeness of her circumstances, she felt more secure in this remote ranch house than she had in years. There was something fundamentally decent about Clayton Prescott, something that put her at ease even as it made her curious about who he really was beneath the quiet, competent exterior. As the weeks turned into months, they developed their own language of gestures and expressions. Katerina learned to read Clayton's moods in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes when he was worried about the cattle or the weather. He learned to interpret her responses in the tilt of her head, the expressiveness of her hands as she gestured, the emotions that played across her face without the filter of words. They worked well together, complementing each other's strengths and weaknesses. When a summer storm rolled through and threatened the livestock, Katerina helped Clayton herd the chickens to safety and secure the barn while rain lashed down in sheets. When he came in soaked and shivering, she had hot coffee waiting and a fire built up in the hearth. When she struggled to move a heavy piece of furniture while cleaning, he appeared as if summoned and helped her without being asked. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their relationship shifted from employer and employee to something more complex. Katerina found herself looking forward to their shared meals, to the quiet evenings when Clayton would read aloud from books he pulled from a small shelf in his room. His voice was deep and pleasant, and she loved listening to him bring the words to life, loved watching his face become animated as he lost himself in the stories. For his part, Clayton seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. He started sharing more about his life, about growing up on this ranch with parents who had carved out a life in the wilderness through sheer determination. He told her about his father, who had died 5 years ago in a riding accident, and his mother, who had succumbed to pneumonia the previous winter after insisting on checking on the animals during a particularly brutal storm. "She was stubborn," he said one night, his voice tinged with affection and grief. "Could never sit still when there was work to be done. I get that from her, I suppose." Katerina reached for her chalkboard. "She sounds like she was a strong woman." "The strongest I ever knew," Clayton agreed. "You would have liked her. She did not put much stock in what society thought people should be or do. She judged people by their actions, not their circumstances." It was clear he missed his mother deeply, and Katerina understood that loss. She had felt it when her aunt died, that particular loneliness that came from losing the one person who truly understood you. Without thinking, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Clayton looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. The air between them suddenly felt charged with something new, something neither of them had anticipated. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Clayton slowly turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "Katerina," he said softly, and the way he spoke her name made her heart race. They sat like that as the fire burned low, hands clasped across the table, both of them recognizing that something fundamental had shifted between them but neither quite ready to name it. The seasons began to change. Autumn arrived with a spectacular display of golden aspens against the evergreen slopes, and the air took on a crisp quality that made every breath feel clean and new. Clayton worked long hours preparing for winter, cutting and stacking firewood, repairing the barn roof, making sure the cattle were ready for the cold months ahead. Katerina threw herself into preserving the garden harvest, filling jars with pickled vegetables and fruit preserves, drying herbs and storing root vegetables in the cellar. She sewed warmer clothes from fabric Clayton brought back from a trip to town, her needle flying through the material as she created shirts and trousers that would keep him warm during the brutal mountain winter. One afternoon in late September, she was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. She turned to see Clayton riding hard toward the house, his face tight with concern. He reined in his horse and dismounted in one fluid motion. "There is a storm coming," he said. "A bad one. I need to bring the cattle down from the high meadow, but it will take time. Can you secure everything here? Bring in extra firewood. Make sure the animals are sheltered, close the shutters." Katerina nodded immediately, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. Clayton looked at her for a moment longer, then did something unexpected. He reached out and cupped her cheek with his hand, his palm warm against her skin. "Be careful," he said. "If the storm hits before I get back, stay inside and wait for me." Then he was gone, riding back toward the mountains at a gallop. Katerina stood frozen for a moment, her hand rising to touch the place where his had been, before shaking herself into action. She worked quickly and efficiently, moving livestock to the barn, hauling armload after armload of firewood from the stack to pile near the door, filling every available container with water from the pump, closing and latching the heavy wooden shutters over the windows. The sky darkened ominously, heavy clouds rolling down from the peaks like a gray avalanche. The first drops of rain began to fall just as she finished her preparations. She stood on the porch, scanning the valley for any sign of Clayton and the cattle. Nothing moved in the fading light except the wind whipping through the grass. The rain intensified quickly, turning from drops to sheets, and thunder rumbled through the mountains like the voice of something ancient and angry. Katerina paced inside the house, unable to settle, worry gnawing at her insides. She knew Clayton was capable, that he had survived in this wilderness his entire life. But fear was not rational. Darkness fell completely, and still he did not return. She kept the fire burning bright and hot, both for warmth and as a beacon. Lightning split the sky in brilliant, terrifying forks, and the wind howled around the house like a living thing trying to get inside. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard the sound of cattle lowing and hoofbeats approaching. She threw open the door despite the rain that immediately soaked her, holding up a lantern to help guide him home. Clayton appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, drenched and exhausted, driving a handful of panicked cattle toward the corral. Katerina helped him get the animals secured, both of them working in the driving rain without speaking, communicating through gestures and shared purpose. By the time they finished and stumbled back into the house, they were both soaked to the bone and shivering. "I could only save 10, Clayton said through chattering teeth. "The others scattered before I could reach them. I will have to search for them after the storm passes." Katerina immediately went into motion, stoking the fire higher, pulling out dry clothes, heating water for coffee and soup. Clayton stood dripping on the floor, too tired to move, and she had to physically guide him toward his room and push dry clothes into his hands. When he emerged a few minutes later, dressed in dry long underwear and trousers with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, she had hot food waiting. He ate mechanically, his body demanding fuel even as his mind seemed far away. "I should have brought them down sooner," he muttered. "I knew the weather was turning." Katerina shook her head firmly and wrote on her chalkboard, "You saved what you could. You did your best." "My best might not be enough," he said, and she could hear the fear beneath the words, the terror of failing, of losing everything his parents had built. She set down the chalkboard and moved around the table to stand beside him. Without overthinking it, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders from behind, pressing her cheek against his damp hair. He stiffened in surprise, then slowly relaxed, his hands coming up to grasp her forearms. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm raging outside while inside. Something quiet and profound bloomed between them. When Katerina finally released him and stepped back, Clayton caught her hand and pulled her around to face him. "I do not know what I would do without you here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Katerina wished desperately that she could respond with words, could tell him that she felt the same way, that this ranch had become home in a way nowhere else had ever been, that he had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Instead, she squeezed his hand and hoped her eyes conveyed what her voice could not. The storm raged for 2 more days. During that time, the house felt both larger and smaller, the two of them coexisting in close quarters with a new awareness of each other. Clayton read to her from a volume of poetry he found, and Katerina listened while mending clothes by the firelight. They cooked together, played cards and talked, or rather, he talked while she listened and responded through her chalkboard when necessary. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke, and weak sunlight filtered through the dissipating clouds. Clayton immediately saddled his horse to search for the lost cattle, and Katerina spent the day cleaning up the damage from the storm, repairing a section of fence that had blown down, and checking on the animals. He returned that evening with 17 additional cattle, dusty and exhausted but clearly relieved. "Found most of them in a box canyon about 5 miles north," he explained. "A few are still missing, but these should be enough to sustain us through winter and rebuild the herd come spring." The crisis had passed, but something had permanently changed between them. Clayton no longer maintained the careful distance he had observed in the early months. He found excuses to be near her, to brush past her in the small kitchen, to help with tasks she could easily manage alone. His eyes followed her movements with an intensity that made her breath catch. Katerina was equally guilty. She found herself noticing things she had overlooked before: the strength in his hands as he worked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the low rumble of his laugh when something amused him. She caught herself daydreaming while she worked, imagining scenarios that made heat rise to her cheeks. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the valley into a winter wonderland. Clayton took her outside to experience it properly, and they walked through the meadow as fat flakes drifted down around them. Katerina tilted her face up to the sky, feeling the cold kiss of snow on her skin, and when she looked back down, Clayton was watching her with an expression that made her heart pound. "You are beautiful," he said simply, as though commenting on the weather. Katerina felt heat flood her face despite the cold air. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that he was handsome and kind and everything she had never dared to hope for, but the words remained locked inside. Instead, she stepped closer and reached up to brush snow from his hair. Clayton caught her hand and held it against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating strong and steady beneath her palm. "I know I have no right," he said quietly. "You did not choose to come here, did not choose me, but Katerina, I have to tell you the truth. I care about you. More than I should, more than is probably wise. You have become essential to me, and not just because you cook and clean and keep this house running. You make this place feel like home again." Katerina's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded frantically, trying to communicate that she felt the same way. Clayton reached up with his free hand and gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I am not good with words," he continued. "But I want you to know that you are not property to me. You never were. You are a person I admire and respect, and if I am being completely honest, have come to love." The word hung in the cold air between them, crystallizing into something solid and real. Katerina pulled her hand free from his grasp and frantically gestured toward the house. They hurried back inside, and she immediately grabbed her chalkboard, her hands shaking so badly she could barely write. "I love you too. I have for a while now. I was afraid to hope that you might feel the same." Clayton read the words, then read them again. When he looked up, his face was transformed by a smile so bright and genuine that it took her breath away. "Really?" he asked, like he could not quite believe it. She nodded emphatically, her own smile matching his. Then, emboldened by his confession, she set down the chalkboard and closed the distance between them. She placed her hands on his chest and rose up on her toes, her intention clear. Clayton needed no further invitation. He cupped her face in both hands and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded with all the passion and emotion she had been holding back. It was her first kiss, and it was perfect, tasting of snow and coffee and hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clayton rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, marry you if you will have me, not because of some paper that says I bought you, but because I choose you and you choose me." Katerina reached for her chalkboard. Yes. To all of it, yes. They spent the rest of that evening making plans, talking about a future that suddenly seemed bright and full of possibility. Clayton explained that they would need to go to Montezuma in the spring to make things legal, to file paperwork that would nullify the bill of sale and instead establish her as a free woman who was choosing marriage of her own will. "I will not have anyone question the validity of our union," he said firmly. "You will be my wife in every sense that matters, but you will also be legally free and independent." It was more than Katerina had ever dreamed possible. She had gone from being sold on an auction block to being loved and cherished by a good man who saw her as his equal. The irony was not lost on her that her silence, once seen as her greatest flaw, had brought her to this moment. Winter settled over the ranch in earnest, blanketing everything in snow and ice. The days were short and the nights were long, but inside the small ranch house, warmth and happiness reigned. Clayton and Katerina spent their evenings close together, planning for spring and summer, dreaming about the future. He taught her to play the harmonica, patiently showing her how to make the small instrument sing, despite her inability to explain what she was hearing. She proved to be a quick learner, and soon she could play simple melodies that filled the house with music. They celebrated Christmas with a small feast and gifts they had made for each other in secret. Clayton presented her with a beautiful leather-bound journal and an elegant pen, encouraging her to write down her thoughts and feelings, to keep a record of their life together. Katerina gave him a new shirt she had sewn, embroidered with a subtle pattern along the collar that had taken her weeks to complete. "It is beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the delicate stitching. "You are so talented." She wrote in her journal, "You make me want to be better at everything." He read over her shoulder and kissed the top of her head. They were becoming increasingly comfortable with casual affection, with touches and embraces that spoke of deepening intimacy. Though Clayton was always respectful of boundaries, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, they made preparations for the trip to Montezuma. Clayton wanted to get there as soon as the mountain passes were safely navigable, wanted to make everything official so they could move forward with their lives without the shadow of her former status hanging over them. They set out on a clear morning in late March, with the snow melting and wildflowers beginning to push through the soggy ground. The journey took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a small inn halfway to town. Clayton paid for separate rooms without being asked, and Katerina appreciated his continued consideration even as part of her wished he would be less of a gentleman. Montezuma looked much as it had the previous summer, though the street was muddy with snowmelt, rather than dusty with summer heat. Clayton took her directly to the office of a lawyer he knew, a tall, thin man with spectacles and an air of bookish distraction. "Mr. Prescott," the lawyer greeted them. "What brings you to town?" "I need to file paperwork regarding Miss Sawyer here," Clayton explained, gesturing to Katerina. "Last summer I purchased her from her uncle under circumstances that I now recognize were not acceptable. I want to legally emancipate her and nullify that transaction. Then, if she is willing, I would like to marry her properly." The lawyer's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "That is quite unusual." "I do not care if it is unusual," Clayton said firmly. "I care that it is right. Can you help us or not?" The lawyer studied them both carefully, his gaze lingering on Katerina's face. She met his eyes steadily, willing him to understand that this was what she wanted. "I can help," he finally said. "It will require several documents and affidavits, and Miss Sawyer will need to provide her mark or signature indicating her consent to all proceedings. It may take a few days to process everything properly." "We have time," Clayton said. They spent the next 3 days in Montezuma while the lawyer prepared the necessary paperwork. Clayton showed Katerina around the town, which looked very different now that she was not being sold in it. They visited the general store, and he bought her fabric for new dresses, ribbons for her hair, small luxuries that made her feel valued and cherished. They ate meals at the small restaurant, and Clayton introduced her to people they encountered, always referring to her as his intended bride, never as his property. On the 3rd day, they returned to the lawyer's office to sign the final documents. The lawyer explained each paper carefully, making sure Katerina understood what she was agreeing to. She read every word, then signed her name in clear, careful script at the bottom of each page. "This document emancipates you from the previous transaction," the lawyer explained, pointing to one. "This one certifies that you are entering into the marriage agreement of your own free will, without coercion. And this one is the actual marriage license, which will be official once you have a ceremony performed by a judge or minister." Clayton looked at Katerina. "Do you want a big ceremony?" "We could wait, have something planned out properly." She shook her head and wrote quickly in her journal, "I just want to be your wife. The sooner the better." He grinned at that. "The lawyer can serve as witness if we can find a judge." It turned out the circuit judge was in town, and within an hour, they were standing in the small courthouse with the lawyer and a clerk as witnesses. The judge, an elderly man with kind eyes, performed a simple ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes. "Do you, Clayton Prescott, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Clayton said firmly, his eyes never leaving Katerina's face. "And do you, Katerina Sawyer, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Katerina nodded emphatically, then remembered the journal in her hand. She opened it and showed the judge where she had written, "I do with all my heart." The judge smiled. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Prescott." Clayton did not need to be told twice. He pulled Katerina into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, pouring all his love and commitment into that single gesture. When they broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. They spent their wedding night at the inn, and this time Clayton only paid for one room. Katerina was nervous as they climbed the stairs together, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. But Clayton was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and loved every step of the way. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Katerina felt a completeness she had never known was possible. Clayton traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, his touch reverent. "I never imagined I could be this happy," he murmured. "You have given me more than I deserve, Katerina Prescott." She smiled at the sound of her new name, then reached for the journal she had left on the bedside table. By the dim light of the lamp, she wrote, "You saw me when everyone else looked through me. You heard me when I could not speak. You gave me a life when I thought I had none. I am the one who is blessed." Clayton read her words, and she saw his eyes grow suspiciously bright. He set the journal aside and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We are both blessed," he said. "And I promise you, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." They returned to the ranch a few days later, and life settled into a new rhythm. Katerina was no longer just the woman who helped run the household. She was the lady of the house, Clayton's partner in every sense. They worked side by side during the busy spring and summer months, branding calves, mending fences, expanding the garden. Clayton proved to be an attentive and loving husband. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow, helped with the dishes without being asked, and never went to sleep without telling her he loved her. For her part, Katerina made sure he knew every day how much she appreciated him, through her cooking, her care for their home, and the way she would pull him close whenever he was within reach. Their first year of marriage flew by in a blur of hard work and simple happiness. The ranch prospered, the cattle herd grew, and they were able to purchase additional land from a neighboring rancher who was moving east. They talked about the future, about children they hoped to have, about growing old together in the valley they both loved. In the spring of 1880, Katerina discovered she was pregnant. She told Clayton by pointing to her belly and then holding up the baby blanket she had secretly been knitting. His face transformed with joy and wonder, and he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing silently. "A baby," he kept saying, like he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." He became impossibly protective during her pregnancy, insisting she rest more and work less, though she largely ignored his hovering. She felt strong and healthy, and she enjoyed the physical changes that signaled new life growing inside her. Their son was born on a cold December morning, with the help of a midwife Clayton had brought from Montezuma 2 weeks earlier. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clayton paced outside the bedroom door, terrified by the sounds of his wife's struggle. But when the midwife finally opened the door and beckoned him inside, he found Katerina propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "You have a son," the midwife announced. "A healthy boy." Clayton approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his child for the first time. The baby was red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. "He is beautiful," Clayton whispered, touching one impossibly small hand with his finger. The baby immediately grasped it, and Clayton felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. Katerina wrote on the slate she kept nearby, "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during her pregnancy, but had not settled on anything definite. Clayton looked at his wife, then at his son, and suddenly he knew. "Marcus," he said. "After my father, Marcus James Prescott." Katerina smiled and nodded her approval. She shifted the baby so Clayton could hold him, and he cradled his son with the same gentle care he showed all precious things. The three of them formed a tableau in the lamplight, a family complete and whole. The years that followed were filled with the chaos and joy of raising children. 2 years after Marcus came Elizabeth, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and expressive eyes. Then came Thomas, Gabriel, and finally, when Katerina was 31, their youngest daughter, whom they named Grace. The ranch house expanded to accommodate their growing family. Clayton built additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen, and the sounds of children's laughter filled the valley. Katerina taught each of her children to understand that communication came in many forms, that words were not the only way to express love and truth. They learned to read her gestures and expressions as naturally as they learned to read books. Marcus, in particular, seemed to have inherited his mother's talent for non-verbal communication. He would often interpret for her when strangers came to the ranch, translating her gestures and written words with a maturity beyond his years. All the children were fiercely protective of their mother, quick to defend her against anyone who dared to suggest her silence was a limitation. Clayton continued to be the solid, dependable center of their family. He worked hard to provide for them, expanding the ranch until they had over 200 head of cattle and a reputation for quality livestock that stretched across Colorado. But he never lost sight of what mattered most. Every evening, no matter how tired he was, he made time to sit with Katerina and talk about their day, about their children, about their dreams for the future. On their 10th anniversary, he gave her a beautiful locket containing a tiny photograph of their family. Inside, he had inscribed, "Your silence speaks louder than words. Forever yours, C." Katerina wore it every day, touching it often as a reminder of how far she had come, of how much her life had changed since that terrible day on the auction block in Montezuma. As the children grew older and began to pursue their own paths, Clayton and Katerina found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, holding hands and existing in the comfortable silence that had always characterized their relationship. "You ever regret it?" Clayton asked one evening when they were both in their early 50s. "The way we started, the circumstances that brought you here." Katerina pulled out the journal she still carried, though it was now volume number 12 in a series that chronicled their life together. She wrote, "I regret nothing except the years before I met you. You gave me a voice through your love and respect. You showed me that words are not necessary when hearts understand each other. If I had to be sold 1,000 times to end up here with you, I would do it gladly." Clayton read her words, blinking back tears. After all these years, she could still surprise him with the depth of her feelings, with the eloquence of her written expressions. "I love you, Katerina Prescott," he said. "More today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built a life of love and purpose from the most unlikely beginning. Their story became something of a legend in the area. People spoke of the mute woman and the cowboy who learned to hear her silence, who built an empire together through hard work and devotion. Young couples would sometimes visit the ranch, asking for advice on how to make a marriage work, and Clayton would always say the same thing. "Listen more than you speak, and understand that communication happens in 1,000 ways beyond words." As they aged, they remained as devoted to each other as they had been in those early days. When Clayton's joints grew stiff with arthritis, Katerina was there to help him with gentle hands and herbal remedies. When Katerina caught pneumonia one harsh winter, Clayton refused to leave her side, nursing her back to health with the same fierce determination he had shown in building their ranch. Their children married and had children of their own, filling the valley with the next generation of Prescotts. Marcus took over the majority of the ranch operations, while Elizabeth opened a school in Montezuma where she taught children that everyone has value, regardless of their circumstances. Thomas became a lawyer, fighting for the rights of those who could not speak for themselves. Gabriel chose to travel, sending letters from exotic locations that Katerina treasured. Grace stayed closest to home, building her own cabin just across the creek with her husband, a kind man who reminded Katerina so much of Clayton in his youth. On a warm summer evening in 1912, Clayton and Katerina sat on their porch, now in their 70s but still holding hands like newlyweds. Their grandchildren played in the meadow, their shouts of joy carrying on the breeze. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to everything they had built together. "It has been a good life," Clayton said softly. Katerina squeezed his hand in agreement. She no longer carried a journal or chalkboard everywhere. After so many years together, Clayton could read her thoughts in the smallest gesture, the briefest glance. They had developed their own language, unique and perfect, built on decades of love and understanding. "I wonder sometimes," Clayton continued, "what would have happened if I had not gone to that auction, if someone else had bought you. The universe works in mysterious ways." Katerina reached over and turned his face toward hers. She mouthed 3 words, the same 3 words she had learned to form silently so many years ago, the words that needed no sound to carry their full weight. "I love you." "I love you too," Clayton replied, as he had replied thousands of times before and would reply thousands of times more. "Thank you for giving me the greatest gift of my life." They sat together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. 2 souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built a legacy of love that would echo through generations. The girl who had been sold because she could not speak had found a man who understood that the deepest truths are often felt rather than heard, that love requires no words when hearts are truly connected. Marcus approached the porch carrying his youngest daughter, a 3-year-old named Katerina in honor of her grandmother. The little girl reached out her chubby arms toward her namesake, and Katerina took her with the practiced ease of someone who had held many grandchildren. "We are heading home," Marcus said. "Ma, are you still planning to help with the preserving tomorrow?" Katerina nodded, bouncing the little girl on her knee. Young Katerina giggled and touched her grandmother's face with curious fingers, seemingly fascinated by the woman who never spoke but somehow communicated so clearly. "She loves you," Marcus observed with a smile. "They all do. You have built quite a legacy, Ma." After Marcus left with his family, Clayton and Katerina remained on the porch, the evening air cooling around them. Clayton began to hum an old tune, one that Katerina had learned to play on the harmonica years ago. She closed her eyes and listened, feeling the vibration of his voice through their joined hands. This was happiness, she thought. Not the dramatic kind found in novels, but the quiet, steady kind that came from building a life with someone who truly saw you. She had been sold like property, treated as less than human because she could not speak. But Clayton had looked past the silence and found the person within, had given her not just freedom but choice, not just shelter but home, not just survival but love. Years later, when Clayton passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, Katerina sat beside his bed and held his hand long after he was gone. She did not cry, though her heart felt broken into 1,000 pieces. Instead, she thought about all the years they had shared, all the moments of joy and struggle, all the ways they had supported and cherished each other. She lived another 5 years after his death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who adored her. She spent her final years writing in her journals, recording the story of her life so that future generations would understand that love could blossom in the most unlikely circumstances, that true partnership required no words, only understanding. When she finally passed away at the age of 76, it was spring, and the valley was carpeted with wildflowers. Her children buried her next to Clayton on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple headstone that read, "Katerina Prescott, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." Her silence spoke louder than words. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family, and with it came the story of how it began. Parents told their children about the woman who could not speak and the cowboy who learned to listen with his heart. It became a reminder that true communication transcends words, that love sees what others overlook, that every person has value regardless of their limitations. In the end, what had begun as a transaction on an auction block became one of the great love stories of the Colorado Territory, a testament to the power of compassion, understanding, and the quiet strength of two people who refuse to let circumstances define their destiny. Katerina had been sold because she could not speak, but she found a man who understood that sometimes silence speaks louder than words, that love needs no voice when hearts beat in perfect harmony. The legacy they built together, of family and hard work and unwavering devotion, echoed through the generations that followed, a gift that multiplied with each passing year. And in the valley where they had lived and loved and raised their family, the wind still whispered their story through the aspens, a love song without words that would never be forgotten.